Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today, after covering the aviation part of the Past to Developers of April 2020, it's now time to get onto the ground vehicles. And may I just say, when it comes to the ground vehicles that have been passed this month, let's just say there are a lot of big thumpers. To start off with, we have one from CATTB, and it's talking about the M1 CATTB. And as you can see, it is a very, very large Abrams project. So what is the M1 CATTB? Well, the CATTB stands for the Component Advanced Technology Testbed, and it was an upgunned version of the M1 Abrams. Pretty much as simple as that. The whole idea of the experiment was to study the possibility of fitting a 140mm gun on an M1 Abrams tank. The upgraded idea would mean that it would need a larger turret, and the new gun was known as the XM291 140mm. It had an autoloader attached to it, and the idea was to double the firepower and kinetic power of the 120mm that it was using at the time. The project itself was initiated in the late 1980s, and the whole point of it was to counter the Soviet threat, which was going to come since reports had come out of good old USSR that they were trying to fit 135mm and 152mm guns onto MBTs. Now these were not unfounded. There were a bunch of projects, especially in that time, the Soviets trying to, fit very large caliber guns on their machines. So of course the NATO states, or the NATO areas such as the US and Germany and France, wanted to try and combat that, and this was the Americans' version. So obviously the crew members of this machine were down to 3. The fact is, with it having an automatic loader, there was no need for it to have 4 crew members, so therefore the turret was designed to accommodate 2 crew members, and then also this meant, since even though you have reduced the amount of crew members, because you have increased to a 140mm gun, you needed way more space in the turret to be able to just hold the shells. And also, there was tests done if they wanted a manual loader or an automatic loader, and they went for an automatic loader because it was found that with a manual loader it would have been slower because of the weight of the shells themselves. Another thing that was also massively upgraded on this machine because of the increased weight of the turret and the gun was its engine. Normally an Abrams has a gas turbine engine, but this machine had a 1,450 horsepower Cummins turbo diesel, which was installed on the testbed, and it also had added to it the latest heat resistance materials that were used in the design of the cylinder block, and also it obviously gave additional pressure to the turbocharger. So this thing had a ton of power behind it in the engine area. It also had other slight increases, such as it had 50 smoke grenade discharges, and I don't think it actually had any machine guns on it, since it was basically just a test bed for the 140mm, and also the armor was, of course, it was supposed to be DU mesh reinforced composite armor. Of course, we don't know the true values of it since it's all classified, but it is something to at least think about. So overall, this obviously never came about. The fact is, with the 140mm gun, even though it was tested and technically the test was successful, some of the large issues why it was never put into service by the Americans was the low ammunition count, because obviously you need less ammunition of 36 rounds compared to its 105 and 120 counterparts, and also its large mass. This thing was a lot heavier than a standard Abrams. It was approximately 70 tons, and also they'd started working on the next generation of Abrams, technically what would be known as the M1A3 at the time, which would receive a 120mm gun and more lightweight materials to make it even, lighter than the previous one. Also, the Germans and the French had unsuccessfully fit 140mm to their modern MBT, so therefore there wasn't really much point. As I said, we're going to go through a bunch of them in this past the developers, but just understand, like, most countries, when it came to, let's call it the Western Bloc, they did try these 140mm ideas. And another one was, once again, from CATTB again, is the Leopard 2 140. So this one, as you can see, has a huge gun, and they did a few less actual adjustments compared to the M1 CATTB, which was a completely new machine. But the Leopard 2 140 was pretty much designed as a prototype of the Leopard 2, which had access to the 140mm Rheinmetall gun. The whole point was exactly the same as we talked about with the Americans. It would be designed to face the upgraded threat of the Soviets, which would have the 135mm or the 152mm gun on their MBT, and this was once again a project in the late 80s. It's as if a lot of these countries work together or something. How weird. But it was a project in the late 80s to build the tank in order to be able to destroy any tank in a single shot. So that was what they were looking for. The 140mm, once again, would or should have had the power of double the kinetic power of a 120mm shell at the time. That's what they were building towards. And a single prototype of this was built, that you can see in the picture, and it was successfully tested in the early 90s. The project was unfortunately cancelled in 1995, though, mainly because, if you remember, in the mid-90s, well, the Soviet Union collapsed, and economically, the Soviet Union was in a horrific position. So any ideas that they were going to be able to, upgun their forces or, increase their military might even more was very much doubtful. So therefore, a lot of these projects kind of fell apart in the mid-90s or even early 90s. So the 140mm armed Leopard 2 was never pushed into production, but it was a design of the program named KWS-3, and the tank was fitted with a new turret with the 140mm, and the gun itself was reported to have a velocity of 2,000 meters per second, and with the 140mm shell. It was supposed to carry 32 shells, which is about 10 less than the regular Leopard 2 with the 120mm, and since the shell was also too heavy to handle by hand, they needed to use an autoloader to be installed. So exactly the same as the Abrams, they went down to a 3-man crew, but the slight difference with this one is the gun was actually moved slightly off to the left of the turret, so they would provide enough space for the loader, or the autoloader, which would be installed on the right, which was kind of interesting. And the turret was powered by an electro-hydraulic motor, which was then used in the 2A4, 5, 6, and 7. So this wasn't just a prototype that didn't go anywhere. They did use certain parts of it, later on in the in their tank design. So yeah, it's kind of as simple as that. There was also a few other parts to it, such as one of the things about the Germans is, at least in the mid-90s, it was noted that the Germans didn't want to use an autoloader. They wanted to avoid it as much as possible because they don't consider it as reliable as a human being. And this is also a sentiment that I've read about when it comes to a lot of American stuff as well, where a lot of American... don't want to say scripture, but you know what I mean. Like, a lot of American documents talk about how they would much prefer a human behind it than a mechanism that could break. So yeah, it's definitely something to think about. And why were there these machines being made? Why were the NATO nations trying to upgun their machines? Well, here is one of the examples why. And once again, it's from CATTB. This is the Soviet equivalent. This is the Object 292, and it was an experimental tank. It was designed at the Kirov plant by JSC Spetsmash and also scientists of the All-Russian Research Institute at Transmash, and it was a prototype based on the T-80U. The whole idea of it is that it fitted a new turret to the T-80U. The chassis would stay completely the same, because basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to create a system which could easily be put onto older chassis. So if they created a turret wholesale and then they could just plop it on old T-80 chassis, therefore it saves a lot of money, and also they had a lot of faith in the T-80 chassis. This turret had in it a 152.4mm smoothbore gun. A massive gun. It actually had the same diameter of chamber as the 125mm, but it was way longer than it. It was an incredibly long gun, and the whole point of the program was to create a gun which could one-shot anything that it came across. So very similar to, as we said, with the Leopard, just from a Soviet angle. So yeah, the whole idea was to be able to just kind of take this turret with the new 152mm and plonk it on top of pre-existing T-80U chassis, so stuff such as the engine and such as the maneuverability are pretty much the same. 1250 horsepower, and then of course torsion bar for the suspension, but the main thing to understand is as you go bigger in gun, it creates a few issues. So the first thing is this Object 292 could only carry 16 shells. And that was it. And remember, you know, the Soviet MBTs are a lot smaller than their NATO counterparts. So yeah, 16 shells is all you got. It also had similar protection to the T-80U, with its composite and reactive armor, so they were happy with that. And the gun, though, because it was larger, well, guess what? It offered horrible depression and also an incredibly slow reload, even with its autoloader. So the mobility of the barrel and the turret was also lower than the regular T-80. So even though, you know, you have this better firepower, actually the gun handling is a lot worse. So that was a bit of an issue with the project. It never got through. The Object 292 that you see, though, it was built in 1990, it was tested in 1991, and it was seen as a success but never put into production, probably because of the Soviet Union collapsing, and this forced the cancellation of the project and many other projects at the time because of lack of funding, because, well, guess what? The Soviet Union in the 90s was pretty much broke. It's kind of as simple as that. The next one we're having a look at is slightly different, and this is from Leclerc G2014, and this is talking about a Warrior modification, and it's definitely an interesting machine. This is the FV510 Warrior LMT105, and this is a one-off prototype which marries two ideas that we've already seen in game. So it was a special variant of the Warrior, which was developed by Alvis, and the only difference really between it is, of course, that you can see is the turret. The turret is actually a South African design, the Denel LIW 105mm GT751, which was a British variant of the L7A1 cannon, which was used, and also the South African LMT turret is the same turret and gun as you see on the Roycat. So this is if you took a Warrior chassis and you put a Roycat turret on it. That's pretty much what you get from this system, which is kind of hilarious, in my opinion. And obviously, this thing never reached mass production, and one of the key details why it never reached mass production is because Alvis was actually bought out by BAE Systems. BAE Systems has a habit of doing this. They pretty much just, you know, buy out a bunch of different companies and kind of absolve them. And then after they finish work on the prototype, before it entered production, the project was completely dropped. So it never saw mass service. It is an interesting prototype though, and you know, we pretty much have all of the basic stuff that we see in the game. You know, we have the Roycat turret with of course the 105, and then we have the Warrior chassis. That's pretty much what this machine is. It's, you know, as simple as that. Moving on, we have another machine, and this is a one from Tasty 95215, and it's talking about a Type 90, but not just a single Type 90. This article actually talks about many different Type 90s because it's talking about the prototypes, but the one that it focuses on is the TKX0002, so the second prototype out of all of them. And the reason why it does this is because it is actually different, or it has decent differences compared to the Type 90 that we have in game. So the first big difference between the 0002 and the actual, the Type 90 we're having game is that they use a different gun. So the Type 90 in-game uses a Rheinmetall 120mm, whereas, well, is it a Rheinmetall? It might be a license-built Rheinmetall 120, but it's, it's a 120mm. This one right here that you see, it is a prototype 120mm L44 gun, which was made by the Japan Steelworks. So this is supposed to actually have better performance compared to the Rheinmetall 120, which is obviously very hard to actually ascertain. But the main thing to understand is this would have a different gun, even though it would be the same caliber as the Type 90 that we see in the game. And the first prototype was actually finished in 1982. The second prototype was finished in 1985 after a long delay, and they both used the indigenously produced 120mm made by Japan Steelworks with an autoloader. So this did have an autoloader, and one thing that was kind of interesting as well during the development of these is that they actually were thinking about installing a 135mm gun made by Daikin Industries, not an actual 120mm, but they actually scaled it down, and they obviously wanted to put in an autoloader for the 135mm, but it seems to, at least according to this article, it was cancelled for unspecified reasons, and probably to do with cost and also impracticability of developing an autoloader for 135mm. So yeah, that's kind of a nice little tidbit. And if you want to know the differences between the 02 and the Type 90, so it has different composite turret armor. The composite on the prototype covers less of the turret than the Type 90. There is no laser warning receiver on the prototype, where there is on the Type 90. They also have different smoke grenades. The prototype uses the same triple smoke grenades as the Type 74, and the Type 90 uses the quadruple 76mm smoke grenades. There's no blowout panels on the prototype, and there's some extra armor plates on the hull as well, which don't really mean too much, and then there's also some minor visual differences as well. So gameplay-wise, it would be different, with obviously the different gun, and also different, mechanics when it comes to, the laser warning receiver and the smoke grenades. So I think it's different enough to put into the game as the TKX0002. And there's also a bunch of other prototypes for the Type 90, and we've also covered the Type 10 prototypes in the past, which all are slightly different from each other. The next vehicle to have a look at is from Finland Supreme, and it talks about a CM-32 armored vehicle, the Clouded Leopard. Now, unfortunately, those links to images have died, so here is one provided from the internet. And this is an interesting vehicle. So the CM-32, it's an armored vehicle. It has a 105mm rifled low recoil main gun. It's made by Taiwan, so this is a Taiwanese vehicle, and it was actually in support of an Irish company. They actually helped out to make it, which is kind of really interesting. Taiwan has bought 1,400 of these armored vehicles so far. The project was launched in 2002, cost around 20 million euros, and unfortunately there were many problems with the initial CM-32s. They didn't really have great armor, and also they leaked oil all over the place. The production of the CM-32 started in 2007. The initial order was 600 vehicles, and currently right now there are 936 CM-32s made, and it's estimated there will be around 1,400 of them produced at the time. the Taiwanese Ministry of Defense in 2019 announced that there were 17 flaws on the vehicle had been found and corrected, such as the armor, oil leaks, and all of this. So, well, hopefully at this point it is at a standard that the Taiwanese are happy with. But yeah, the armor on it is all-around protection against 7.62mm AP, so really nothing to write home about. It's got a main gun of a 105mm M68A1. It's also got 2 smoke grenade discharges and a 7.62mm machine gun, and yeah, it's pretty much very similar to a lot of the other vehicles that we see at high tiers, like at 9.3, you know, the Type 16, but this is a Taiwanese version. It's a little bit more blocky as well, with the extended size of the chassis. The last vehicle on the list is once again from CATTB, and we're going back to the big thumpers. As you can see, this is the Leclerc, but this isn't just any Leclerc, it is the S4, or as it's known as the Terminator, or the Terminator. And this actually has probably the most interesting story of all of them, whereas the Leopard T140 and the M1 CATTB projects were kind of cancelled in the 90s, you know, and same with the Object 292. This one was actually kind of revived most recently. So the Leclerc T4 started life in 1996. It was a concept for fitting the 140mm gun instead of the 120mm, and as you know we've talked about before, it was exactly designed the same as the Leopard 2140 and the M1. The whole idea was to be able to knock out any machine that it saw with a single shot, and also to be able to, to be able to stand up to the larger caliber guns that the Soviets were thinking of putting in. But once again, the Soviet Union fell and the project was put on hold and was pretty much just shut off. The prototype was built though, and after the project was put on hold, the turret itself was stored and the hull used for other stuff. Then though, the project was revived. The project was revived in 2014, so over 20 years after, well actually just less than 20 years after the project had been ceased. It was revived because the Russians obviously recently released their new generation of MBTs. You know, we've seen them, the Armata and all of this. And if you don't know, France and Germany have been working together for a very long time on a new Franco-German tank that would replace both the Leclerc and the Leopard 2 in French and the German armed forces. So the future tank as of now, we obviously don't really know a lot about it, but the idea is that it's going to be a hybrid between the Leclerc and also the Leopard 2. And the general idea is to take the Leopard chassis, which is highly reliable, and also the engine of the Leopard 2, and put the high-tech Leclerc turret on top of it, and then also upgrade the 120mm from both machines to a 140mm. But then here comes the controversy. So of course there are two separate companies that make different guns for each of these two systems. You have GIAT or GIAT on the French side, and then you have Rheinmetall, which of course makes the 120 for the Germans. Both of these want to create the 140mm for this Franco-German tank, and so basically what GIAT did is on the 50-ton tank, just to show that, you know, they could create this 140, they took the old project, so the old turret that they created in the 90s, and they put it on top of a chassis. And the chassis used to be a turretless Leclerc Mars armored recovery vehicle, and in 2017 it was revealed to the public as the old turret from the 90s with this new chassis. So the actual, I suppose, evolution of the vehicle hasn't really happened, but it's just, you know, the actual, it's the only project out of the three that we've talked about from the NATO side of things which is still up and running, which is still going today, which is kind of interesting to see. There is also the fact that right now it's looking like the tank will never be put into service because of the fact that it's just kind of a test bed to show that the 140mm does fit. There's also other factors like, you know, the fact that will the NATO nations ever actually have to upgrade to the 140mm? I know for a fact that Germany has talked about it a lot, but other nations not so much. So yeah, it's just one of those things to think about. And also, the nickname of this is the Terminator, or Le Terminateur, and it comes from the original tank, which was tested in 1996. The French traditionally used to provide nicknames to their tanks, just like, America does for ships, and the prototype was named Terminateur, which was written clearly on the turret's side, and was the most obvious details in the pictures from the 90s. So the turret on the prototype in 2015 was the same turret, but the chassis was a different one, but the name still sticks on the new prototype. So yeah, it's just one of those things where they still call it, you know, the same nickname, which is kind of cool. You know, it's a little bit of history, and obviously being a French tank, it has an autoloader, it has a crew of 3, it has 31 rounds for the autoloader, and a 12.7mm coax and a 7.62mm on top. It has a diesel engine with 1500 horsepower, the V8X SACM. So yeah, it's just another NATO 140mm. So you can see why, you know, I said that this was, you know, this list of vehicles was very much designed to be the big hitters, and probably will be the next step in a lot of nations' vehicles over the next years or so when it comes to ground. The big 140 massive hitters. So yeah, it's lovely to see them pass to the developers, and also lovely to actually talk about them. Even though a lot of the information is still classified on them, it's nice to give a general reason and overview of why they exist and, you know, where to find more information on them. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Eugene's Terry, Daniel Stanton, Blackie, Elove Goat, Jay Wilt, Martinez, B. Young, Chris Giltnane, Trigger Hippie, Ambrosius McClellan, and also Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.